But today we have a special guest, and I'm very happy that we were able to have Chris, and we'll introduce in a minute. We had to do some paperwork with Lorenzo. Thank you, Lorenzo, because every time I tried to get a hold of Chris, he was in Mongolia, someplace. I don't have Wi-Fi. I can't do it. Okay, next time. Where are you? I'm in Greenland. Really? Where? Greenland? And this guy is all over. Going to Milan. What is it? Polynesia next?
Yes, a couple of weeks.
So this is really a big treat. It's very important for architecture students to hear and open their hearts and mind to non-architecture issues. It's fundamental, really. It's really fundamental. The education as an architect will be so much more valuable if you really open your mind to it. So this is why we bring Chris today, to open our minds in a topic, of course, is very dear to some of us, but it should be dear to everybody, since it's something that exists across time and space in this planet Earth for humanity. So thank you, Chris, very much. I will introduce, ask our Walton critic 2013-23. I'm going back in time. Travis Price. Without Travis, we could not have Chris here. So from the moment I asked him to be a Walton for this year, he told me I need to bring Chris. So please, Travis, can you introduce Chris?
Yes, I'm not Chris. I'm just Travis. I don't know how to begin this because there's a million things to say about Chris, besides one of my best friends, one of my great buddies, along with Wade Davis. The three of us have often gone around the world seeing the most amazing architecture there is, on taking tours, people. We're called the Three Amigos occasionally at National Geographic. But I have to read to you, it's been edited down from 20 pages to half, who Chris is. So I'll tell you a few funny things later. Chris Rainier is a documentary photographer, different, filmmaker, and National Geographic Society explorer. That's a big deal to be an explorer, who is highly respected for his documentation of endangered cultures and traditional languages around the globe. In 2002, he was awarded the Lowell Thomas Award by the Explorers Club in New York City for his efforts on cultural preservation. And in 2014, he was elected Fellow of the Royal National Geographic Society of London. He is the founder and director of the Cultural Sanctuaries Foundation, a global charitable foundation focusing on preserving biodiversity and extremely important traditional culture, ancient culture, and modern culture today. During his tenure with the National Geographic, as a National Geographic Fellow, Chris was the co-founder and co-director of both the Enduring Voices, which is how to take all the languages, we're losing 2 a month in the world right now, and bring them back together. Director of All Roads photography program, designed to support indigenous groups with modern technology to document their traditional culture and to create sustainable solutions to preserve the planet in the 21st century. Chris has completed photographic projects for United Nations and endless New York Times, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Cambodia, and so on. Time Magazine covers everything. But in the early 80s, Chris was Ansel Adams' last photographic assistant. And if you know Ansel Adams, he's an extraordinary photographer, America, black and whites, hung out with George O'Keeffe. I mean, this is top cream. And he worked with Mr. Adams to help amplify the use of art photography as a social tool, helping to preserve the threatened wilderness areas and national parks. I can go on with the museums, the books he has written. You'll want to get them all after this tonight. The Spirit of the Mask, Keepers of the Spirit, where masks still dance. Really amazing photography where people around the world are still living in their cultures. New Guinea, Ancient Marks, the Grand Canyon, River at Risk, Cultures on the Edge, and Mask. Oh, Mask is something. And just now released last week, Future of Exploration with Terry Garcia, who was the head of all of National Geographic Explorers for years. He and Chris put together something with a nice opening by Richard Branson. So you get your book soon, because Richard Branson just sent it out to his 15 million followers on Instagram. I have to tell you, it's a great book. And I've had the honor of writing a couple of chapters in these books. And I want to welcome Chris, best friend forever, and hope you guys will be taken on a journey tonight that you won't forget. Thank you.
Thank you, amigo. Thank you very much. And it's a great honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you, Julio. Thank you, Trav. Thank Catholic University. So tonight, what I'd really love to do, or this afternoon, is take you on a journey. So just imagine a magic carpet has just pulled up here. And I'd like to see if this is going to work. Let's try that. Yay. So imagine we are now on the carpet above the earth. So when I was born in 1958, 3 billion people were on the planet. Today, there are 8 billion people in just that short period of time. Over 200 species a day die. As Trav mentioned, every 2 weeks, a traditional elder of a caretaker of an oral language passes away. Every 2 weeks, an entire knowledge base. As my good friend Wade Davis once said, that's like burning down a library every 2 weeks. Once that elder passes, immense 10,000 generations of information passes away. Almost 4 billion images, bits of information are downloaded on the internet every single day. 4 billion. So we're at this kind of crucial crossroads of human evolution. The planet is under duress. But yet, deep in the forests, where the trails end, across the Sahara Desert, or high in the Himalayas, or in the land of Mongolia, where Olivia and I just returned from last week, are sacred cultures that still dance to an ancient theme, cultures that still create rituals around birth and death, life and reincarnation. So tonight, I would like to take you on those journeys into some places that I've experienced. Now, I have to get you back in an hour, so we better get going. One of the first places that I began to kind of really follow the sacred path in the sense of curiosity of cultures that were different than mine was in the Southwest Desert. As Trav mentioned, in the 1980s, I was Ansel Adams' last photographic assistant. So his studio was in Carmel, California. What little free time I had, I would dash to the Southwest Desert, the Four Corners, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and that general area, and go in search of what I found to be sacred cultures. These are ancient cultures that would illustrate this 16-foot-long serpentine that once a year on the solstice, the sun shaft hit the head of that rattlesnake and then disappeared. Cultures that were in tune with a different way of being. When we discovered this during COVID, Olivia and I drove around and we went in search of some other rock art in the Southwest. We found this amazing panel about 10 miles up the trail, and I hovered my hand over those handprints, and I imagined who were on the other side. I could almost touch palm to palm with a culture from ancient existence. And so it was really this time in the Southwest Desert in the early 1980s that I decided, after I left the Ansel Adams studio, was to go in search of sacred cultures. That was 1980. I haven't finished yet. I got on a plane and I have not stopped. And I followed that flow of curiosity of what is sacred? What is sacred to a Muslim? What is sacred to a Hindu? What is sacred to an atheist? What is sacred to an Aborigine living in the dream time? So one of the first places I went to was India. I went to Varanasi, the city of light, the oldest city in India. For a Hindu, to die in Varanasi naturally is to be ensured of the ultimate transformation into enlightenment, ending the cycle of karma. Each morning, people come down to the Ganges, a river that flows from the high Himalayas, to pray and bathe in the early bright white light of Varanasi. Varanasi is home to Lord Brahma, the creator, Lord Shiva, the destroyer. These are the two most powerful Hindu gods. The struggle between these two forces is the struggle of good and bad, light and dark, from divinity to Dante's Inferno. Here you will find the Lord of the Untouchables, the keeper of the burning ghats, and the spirit being that holds the key to a person's reincarnation. And with his morning offerings to the river Ganges, a Hindu man can be assured life is again in karmic balance. Traveling north of Varanasi, you arrive in the high country of Tibet, where here in the great peaks of the Himalayas, the driving winds and absence of water leaves life clinging sparsely to the landscape. Here you step to the edge and life has no room for extravagance. Here in the high mountains, it is possible to conclude that what you don't accomplish holds equal importance with what you do. Here, the absence of life and the void created by nature forces you to examine a spiritual dimension that we in the West sometimes lose in our trips to the store and the bathroom mirror. Here in Tibet, dreams of material possession and accomplishment are tinged with dark futility. After leaving the Ansel Adams studios, after a series of trips to the Himalayas, I decided to stay longer. I felt that by slowing down, I could go beyond the cliches, go beyond the stereotypes of any one of the cultures, because humans tend to be ethnocentric. We see the world through our own vision of what the world is, a very Western concept. So as the great poet Minor White said, slow down until the object of your attention affirms your presence. And then, for me, it was time to photograph. So I lived in a monastery for 3 months. I gained permission from the Rinpoche high up on the Tibetan plateau, spent most of the winter there, slowing down. At that time, I was using a large format camera, which in itself slows the process down. And I began to realize that what I needed to do was stop and reserve judgment. For example, this image here, a very charged symbol. In fact, the Hindu word for this symbol is swastika. Those 4 dots are the 4 elements of life: earth, wind, fire, sky. This is the most sacred symbol, not only for Hindus and Buddhists, but many traditional animistic indigenous cultures around the world. But I needed to slow down, stop, reserve judgment to learn to ask the right questions. And for me, that's why I continue to travel. That's why I continue to challenge myself of what is sacred and what is not. Because again, I have the handicap of living in a Western culture, and I want to learn what other cultures reveal. And as a visual storyteller and a photographer, I have to do that. I have to take photographs to show people like yourself and the audience of National Geographic a different world, a different understanding. Spent 3 months there, eventually became a Buddhist. I'm a practicing Buddhist now. I believe in Buddhism as a philosophy, not a religion, and follow a lot of that. What I love about going to Tibet again and again is I peel away the layers. I see something very differently. We've spent a lot of time in Bhutan. This image is taken in Bhutan, which is a small kingdom that is right beside Nepal, just on the Tibetan border. And it is a remarkable place. They have a concept of gross national happiness, not gross national product, but they believe their product comes from happiness. The concept that when I sit down and do a transaction with somebody, my main mission is not to get the best deal. but is to ensure the other person is more happy than I am. And from that, everybody gets a good deal. Everybody wins. It's a very Buddhist concept. So scattered across the Tibetan plateau are these mani walls, sometimes a mile long. This particular one is about 6 feet tall. That is a chorten at the end that houses the remains of a sacred, respected Buddhist priest. But what's so interesting is each and every one of those rocks are etched with the Tibetan chant, Om Mani Padme Hum, which loosely translated basically says, "O Buddha, O lotus petal, give me eternal life. Let me come back again and again to learn the lessons more correctly." As you float off the high Himalayas, you arrive in Southeast Asia, and very specifically, you arrive in Cambodia. Asia is of two worlds. One world is the slow ticking of time in the tropical forest, where the mind moves reluctantly and the spirits hold their own ancient forms. And here, among the musty decay of monuments to Buddha, nature takes a stance and reclaims all that man has made. My fascination was to go to a place where nature actually takes over again, that what man creates, all the buildings we create, in the end are impermanent. Nature grows back over. And this whole entire complex, which is hundreds of square miles, is a visual manifestation for that. This is a particular waterfall that the waters dance across all of these Hindu deities. And of course, this was the center of some of the most egregious atrocities during the 1980s. The Khmer Rouge came in, and this was the killing fields. When I first went in the 80s, I was working for Time magazine as a war correspondent, and one of the places, of many places that I went, was Cambodia. So I did my assignment and then snuck into Angkor Wat and had a chance to spend about a week photographing around these ancient temples. And if you ever have a chance to go there, it's quite remarkable. As I was there, I met some of the monks that had not been slaughtered by the Khmer Rouge, and they had this remarkable tattooing on their body. I eventually went on, based upon seeing this tattooing and some of the tattooing, traditional tattooing in Polynesia, to spend about 15 years doing a book on traditional tattooing. I followed the flow of ink around the world and went to all of these different remarkable places where the culture manifested its sacredness, its spiritualism on the human body. And so many of the monks had this remarkable form of tattooing, which they do when they're in a trance with a 12-foot long sword. They dip the ink, and the other monk will actually penetrate the skin in a traditional form. Many of the Buddhists in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, believe that you shouldn't mark the body. So there's a very small sect that do the tattooing. But what those Buddhists do is called white magic tattooing. So they'll go to the priest, there will be a kind of coconut oil that's blessed, and they will be tattooed with a coconut oil, and it doesn't show up on the body, but the metaphor is the sacredness of that tattoo goes into their body. Another area that I love to travel, and we recently went there, is Burma. I call it Burma. It's Myanmar, but is Burma, which is a Buddhist country. Beautiful, amazing architecture. And again, remnants of buildings that are decaying and going back into nature. We were in Pagan, which is one of the sacred cities of Burma, and it's an epicenter of young monks being trained. They had these remarkable lying statues of Buddha that sometimes are 50 to 100 feet long in these caves. We were frolicking around, photographing, and then this intense young monk who had been following me for about an hour came in, was watching us, turned around, I was photographing, turned back, and he had jumped up on this little ledge. I got one frame off of this kind of connection, eye to eye, and then he scampered off. The other part of Asia is the high-tech world of a place like Japan. When I did the tattooing project, of course, I had to photograph the Japanese mafia, the Yakuza, and they're known for their elaborate tattooing. So you can't just walk up to the Japanese mafia and get permission. So during this period of time when I was doing this project, you would often find me in that part of the newsstand, that new dubious part of the newsstand that has all the tattoo magazines, looking through and trying to see ideas, see people that were doing tattooing. And I noticed this article on a Japanese tattoo artist, highly respected around the world. And I noticed his pinky was missing. And that is the sure sign that you've been initiated into the Yakuza. So this was my way in. So I jumped on a plane, went to Tokyo, brought my other books to him, and said, I would like to be able to photograph the Yakuza. And he said, no, impossible. So I spent 5 years calling him every couple of months. And I think after 5 years, he realized I wasn't going to go away. So eventually he said, okay, jump on an airplane, be here tomorrow. And I had gotten permission. So I was embedded within the Yakuza for about 10 to 15 days. And it was a remarkable experience. This particular individual, this is the Ginza area, very popular area in Tokyo. This is on a Sunday morning. Very few people there. I set him up. I had my lights all set up. And then I noticed 2 police cars came screaming up. A bunch of officers came running over. He didn't even go out of pose. He just said something in a very dismissive tone. They bowed, walked backwards, and got in their cars and left. So I certainly knew who was in charge of the neighborhood. So I would often scout out locations. There's a very sacred rock garden in Kyoto. Some of you may have been there. It's considered one of the most sacred Shinto temples. And this is it. I wanted to photograph one of the Yakuza in the temple, but I knew I couldn't even begin to get permission from the monks. So I went in, scouted, set up my lights, had my assistant. The Yakuza came in with his tracksuit. Behind me here is about 100 tourists wondering, what is this guy doing? And the monks curiously watching. He took off his tracksuit. I got off about 3 frames before we were very ungraciously picked up and thrown out of the temple, never to come back again. But I got my image, so I knew that was the way to do it. Along the way, this remarkable tattoo artist that I became friends with showed me a book. And in one of his books was this dynamic photograph of a naked woman with a tattoo on her back. I said, I want to photograph her. That tattoo is amazing. And he went, this is a problem. She is the head concubine of the head of the Yakuza. This could take a while. This could be a problem. So I persisted and I persisted. A year later, get the phone call, come to Tokyo. I rented this hotel room that had a kind of feeling of a Japanese tea room and had the chance to photograph her. What you don't see is the 3 250-pound security guys behind me packing pistols, videoing the whole thing. I had a chance to photograph it. And of course, I'm here to say that I haven't upset the Yakuza because I still have my pinkies. So I am very focused. When I get going on a project, nothing gets in my way, and I'll be persistent for a very long time. Another example of that is for my book, Masks, which was a 16-year project of documenting traditional mask rituals around the world. I want to do the samurai. Well, it's very difficult because in Japan, in contemporary Japan, of course, there aren't the samurai, but a status symbol for a very wealthy Japanese businessman is to have his family sort of icons created in terms of a samurai mask. These masks and costumes are put on a little stand, but to get access to that was very difficult. You have to rent the mask and the costume, and then you have to rent someone who is a distant relative of original samurai. Only they are allowed to wear the costumes and go through the ritual of photographing the samurai costumes. So many of these projects, for each image I take, it's months and years of diligently researching it and often going to a place 3 or 4 or 5, 6 times over until I get the perfect image. Now, north of Japan is the country of Mongolia, where we have just returned. It is approximately the size of Western Europe or Western United States, yet the population is only 3 million people. Half of those people live in a very Soviet-esque era grubby town called Ulaanbaatar, and then the rest of the country. Imagine Western United States without any roads and traditional nomadic people that are still alive, existing, living in what are called gears or their yurts. Our particular focus is the Cossack eagle hunters, the golden eagle hunters. And so we are working in partnership with them and doing a project with them to build a cultural center with them. So the first time we went there, we drove about 5 days off the road, no electricity except for the generator that the eagle hunter community had. Up on this beautiful hill, we scouted this particular location. I wanted to take them up and do this photo shoot way up on top of the hill. We're sitting there, beautiful eagle, amazing regalia. And as I often do, I will photograph my models with an iPad so I can turn the iPad over and show them the image. And so I did this with him, and he kind of smiled and went, "Oh, I like the photograph. Can I get a copy?" So in very traditional fashion, I brought out my piece of paper and started to write down his address. And he went, no. Just airdrop it and I'll put it on Facebook tonight. And that is the world that we live in. We live in a world in the 21st century where in the deepest jungles of New Guinea or the savanna of Mongolia or deep in the Sahara Desert, you have this modern technology. And why not? We shouldn't be the ones saying, no, we're going to destroy the culture. We can't do that. And that's what I love about the 21st century is that there are many cultures that are in fact using this technology to preserve, maintain, and amplify their culture. So we've been going back year after year and documenting all of the traditions. So these photographs can be a part of an archive for future generations. In our particular projects, we only go where invited. And many of these cultures, including the eagle hunters, are desperate for some help to have the technology to be able to preserve their language and their traditions. And so when that elder passes away, if that language has been documented and a dictionary has been created, future generations can work with that. Our project in Bhutan, we wrote the first dictionary of the indigenous language, which of course, there were only 3 speakers. Now with that dictionary created, it's being taught to the young children, it's being amplified, and those traditions are continuing. This was taken about a week and a half ago, up in the far western part of Mongolia. Winter is coming on strong, the snows, and for me, it's just evocative of the pride of this particular culture. Sliding out of Mongolia, you drop down into Australia. I spent most of my youth growing up in Australia, and I heard about these remarkable etchings, Dreamtime etchings. So I spent a lot of time photographing this rock art, as well as rock art around the world. But this rock art is some of the oldest rock art in the world, 50,000 years old. That etching is 50,000 years ago. And in fact, the Aborigine Dreamtime is the longest continuing religion, if you will, spiritualism that's in existence in the world. It's still very much a part of their culture and the song lines. And the privilege of being able to sit down with Aborigine shamans and try and understand their religion. They believe in all time exists at the same time, future, past, live in the present. And the country, the continent of Australia is divided up into these song lines of migration where they trade the stories. Look at this. Now, aliens just might exist, and they may have had contact with them. So when I grew up in Australia, I also heard of this very exotic land north of Australia, the island of New Guinea, Stone Age culture. And so I wanted to return there and go there as an adult. So I had the privilege of being able to do an assignment in 1985. I fell in love with this place where masks still dance, where the rituals of birth and death are still dancing in the rituals around the campfire at night, masks that have great traditions and great origins back to the beginning of time. I decided to go to New Guinea. I spent 6 months of each year for 10 years, systematically working my way around the archipelago of New Guinea. New Guinea is divided in half. The eastern half is Papua New Guinea, which got its independence from Australia in 1975. The western side is Irian Jaya, or West Papua, that is a province of Indonesia. I would hire a dugout canoe, go up rivers for months on end, or I'd buy a one-way ticket with a Cessna to fly deep into the highlands. This woman is preparing for a wedding. She's about 500 miles from the coast, and yet she has this shell that is clearly from the coast. The anthropologist that I was traveling with determined by the number of those dots across the top of the shell that that shell had been traded over 300 years from the coast. Very rarely do people move out of their area. Even today, in 2023, there are uncontacted tribes. There are literally 1,200 languages, not dialects, 1,200 languages on the island of New Guinea. You can go from one valley to the next and not be able to speak the language. These are the famous sort of Asaro mudmen, famous for their mud masks and their bamboo shoot fingers. About halfway through the project, I had heard of this ritual that was going to take place of an initiation. A boy was going from childhood into adulthood into kind of a warrior status. So the day before this image was taken, I had hiked up and over, down that hill, all the way up, and just camera right was an old man sitting there. And he had watched me kind of huffing and puffing and coming up the hill. And I sat down beside him, and I often, with my little kind of expedition of 5 or 6 people, would have translators, sometimes 2 or 3 translators to go from English to Pidgin to the local dialect to the very specific dialect in that valley. And as I sat down, the old man looked at me and said, "Which valley are you from?" And I smiled and I said, "Many, many valleys away." And he kept persisting, "No, which valley are you from?" And I said, "Oh, many, many valleys away." And it quite conceivably, as a white person, he'd never been out of his valley, so I could have been his next door neighbor. And eventually he smiled and he looked up at the sky and he says, "I know, you're from where the green meets the blue." You came from a place that he had heard of, the concept where the land ran out and the ocean began. And I love that metaphor. I wrote it down because in a way, we're all from where the green meets the blue, this small, finite planet spinning out in the universe. About 12 years ago, I had a chance to lecture at the TED conference, and I lectured, and then the last female astronaut to be on the space shuttle lectured. And then after the lecture in the back in the green room, she came up to me and said, "You're right. I used to sit out in space and look at the Earth, this green and blue ball, and then I'd look out into infinity, and I'd look back at Earth, and I'd realize where the green meets the blue, this small, finite planet that we need to do a better job saving." So as I mentioned, I divided New Guinea up into 19 different locations, systematically going back to all these different locations. One day I was walking along the trail, and this old man had this beautiful plumage of birds of paradise, these remarkable feathers. And he was staring up at a tree, and the tree was full of birds of paradise. So through my guide, I asked a very Western question: "How many birds up there?" So he talked back and forth with the old man. And in an embarrassed tone, a couple minutes later, he said, Chris, we don't have words for numbers. And I thought, what a primitive culture. And then I stopped and I knew I had to learn to ask the right questions. What do they see that we don't see? What do they perceive without numbers that we cannot even begin to see? What do we miss when we're sitting on our cell phones or zooming around in our cars that people deep in the forest know and understand that we've lost contact with a long time ago? This is down in the Maprik area along the Sepik River. They worship the yam, the sweet potato. So many of these masks, many of these rituals, many of these costumes are all about the person who wears them takes on the persona of the person that makes the connection with the other world. Often you can figure out who the shaman is in a village because they're off to the side. They're a little not fully there because a large part of them is in the other world, and they bridge that gap. And these masks and mask rituals allow them to bridge that gap. Well into the trip, I was working for Time magazine, so I'd take a time off from covering the war in Sarajevo or covering the genocide in Rwanda. And I had heard that there was going to be a battle, and there are often these ritualized battles for compensation in New Guinea. And so I had just heard about this battle. I was about to head into the valley. It was going to take me 2 or 3 weeks to hike into this valley. Got a telexes at that time, from Time magazine. Would you replace a photographer in 5 weeks who's coming out of Sarajevo and you can come back in? I said, yes. Hiked in, and this battle, basically someone had stolen something from the other village, so they were going to do compensation. This is a culture of compensation. So basically the battle would continue until someone was killed. Took 3 days, got right into the middle. They had their spears, they had their bows and arrows. Eventually someone got killed. Then the compensation was over. They shook hands and they went back to daily life. And that's how New Guinea culture unfolds. Got my photographs, hiked out, got on a plane. Within 3 days, I was in Sarajevo during the worst fighting of the Bosnian War. Sitting there one night on the roof of the Holiday Inn in Sarajevo, watching the rockets overhead. And I went, you know what? It's quite amazing. We have the conceit that we've actually evolved as human species. And as we can tell in Gaza and Ukraine, the only thing we've evolved is the sophistication of how we kill each other. And that was a lesson from New Guinea. I had followed the Michael Rockefeller story. Some of you may know of that. It's a generational story. Governor of New York in the 1960s, his son went to New Guinea and disappeared. I was fascinated with the story. I went to the very village, very warlike there. They have these incredible war canoes. And so this is one afternoon as they're kind of practicing their battle rituals out at sea. As much as they appreciate and honor life, they also appreciate and honor death. Many of the tribes believe in reincarnation. When someone passes away in this village up in Mount Hagen, the women will cover themselves with mud and then put this elaborate strings of Job's tears around their neck, up to 300. So for every day they take off a string, and that at the end is the end of the mourning process. They also believe in when an elder passes away and the body is decayed, they take the skull and they decorate it and they honor that particular deceased person. Up in a particular isolated area in Irian Jaya, I had heard where they mummify the elders. So hiked into the village late in the afternoon, and I knew there was a mummified elder there. And so I was asking permission from the chief. The chief said, yes, you can spend the night, but the photographer has to sleep in the hut with a mummified elder. So you can imagine crackling fire, mummified elder, myself sitting over in the corner, terrified. In this area down on the Sepik River, when someone passes away, her husband has passed away, the women or the other person is not allowed to be seen. Their eyes are not allowed to be seen. The two brothers have shaved the heads. But most interesting is this rattan necklace. And this necklace is the symbolic connection to the spirit. So the spirit lies in limbo until this necklace rots away. And then at that time, the spirit is free to go into the afterworld. So about 9 years into my project, a guy that I'd been using every year died of cerebral malaria. It's quite common in that area. I had malaria 3 times. Luckily, didn't come down with cerebral malaria, but he got it. He passed away. We took his body back to the village. And in that area, what they do is build a spirit canoe, a symbolic canoe. Those are the totems of his family, his clan, his siblings. And at sunset, they push that off, and that spirit goes into the sunset. And one of the great privileges of being an explorer or alive in the 20th, 21st century is the opportunity, the possibility that you could, if you gain permission, make contact with cultures that have never been around white people or other cultures. We found such a place up in the northwest part of New Guinea. I loved it because on the map it said no data available. And that's the kind of places I love to go. And we hiked 6 weeks in, and indeed we made contact with a village, a culture, a valley that had never had contact with the outside world. We had a number of translators. We sat around, we told stories of what it meant to be human. Remarkable exchange of ideas, a moment in my life that I'll never forget, of this kind of cross-culture communication of level of respect. At the end of our time, we were packed up. It was a beautiful day. The kids were kind of frolicking around. I had my bags, my camera all set, and it was a sunny day. And then suddenly this thunderstorm came rolling up the hill. They got out their very fashionable raincoats, banana leaf raincoats. The storm passed, the sun was setting, and I looked up in the sky, and there was probably 30,000 feet above me, this jet, white trail going across the sky, probably on its way from Brisbane or Sydney to Kuala Lumpur or Bangkok. And it struck me, what an amazing time to be alive at this crossroads of human evolution. What a remarkable time for all of you to be alive, where there are still cultures with one foot in the Garden of Eden, places beyond where no data is available, that pulse with the sacred way of life. And we are so privileged to be alive at this moment with these kind of opportunities. Float out of New Guinea, you jump across the Pacific, you hit Machu Picchu in Peru, the sacred geography of Machu Picchu. And I had the privilege to be a part of a National Geographic documentary that Wade Davis and I did called Light at the Edge. And we did a whole documentary on the sacred geography. How does geography, how does place affect what is sacred? Is that place sacred before you build the building or after? Or does it eventually become sacred in the 21st century? And this is a question that I'm fascinated, whether you're going to Easter Island or the Taj Mahal or to a church here. Is that a sacred place, or does it become a sacred place? What is sacred? And in fact, my book on sacred came out of a frustration of not really knowing what sacredness was. So I decided to go around the world and interview different cultures as to what that meant. Beautiful in the January and February months, the rainy season down there, the mist rolls in and out, and you see these different kind of mini temples, and you wonder what they are indicating, and then the mist parts, and you see a mountain that it relates to afterwards. Also, the Nazca lines down on the coast of Peru. This ancient culture, some 900 years ago, created these incredible markings that you can only see once you get up into a helicopter or an airplane. To spend your entire culture, your entire life, slaving away to create these symbols, these sacred symbols or sacred animals like this hummingbird, and not to be able to experience it. What does that mean? What does that say about sacredness? My father was South African. I grew up a lot in Africa, and one of my favorite places to go in Africa is Egypt. I was given an assignment to photograph the architecture along the Nile, but also the culture that exists there today. This is the day after a full moon. I love to go to remarkable places, sacred places like the pyramids or Taj Mahal or Easter Island on a full moon and photograph it during the moon. And this is the day after I had spent the night up on the third distant pyramid. And I was walking back to my vehicle, cast my eyes back, and there was the mist burning off these beautiful pyramids. This is Abu Simbel in the south, also on a full moon, photographed at night. And when I was there, I began to cast my eyes west into the desert. The Bedouins would often come out of the western part of Egypt, or even as far away as Sudan or Chad, on their camels, and they would arrive at the pyramids and just kind of pray in euphoria. I was curious about what it meant to go into the desert, almost in a religious fashion. I wanted to go into the desert. So I put together an expedition out of Timbuktu. There is a place, real place, Timbuktu, to an ancient salt mine, some 500 miles into the Sahara Desert. We put the expedition together. We did the research and realized that there's an ancient salt mine that's 500 miles into the Sahara Desert, and there's a almost daily migration of camels going up to pick up the salt. So as we headed out of Timbuktu, 14 days up to the salt mine, through the translator, they kept talking about the eye of the needle. And I said, what's the eye of the needle? What is the eye of the needle? Come to find out, all the sand dunes in this part of the Sahara ran east and west. We were going north, and the only place to take the camels through was a place called the Eye of the Needle. We passed through. We would often travel late at night, early in the morning, or on the full moon, come into these edgy oases where the Tuaregs, the blue men of the desert, were covered in their cloth, and they would gather on a Friday in front of the mosques. And after they had stepped in and the Oman had given the prayers, they would open up their Quran and read with the shafts of the midday sun. Timbuktu was the center of Muslim learning in the 12th and 13th century. There were 30,000 Muslim students in Timbuktu in the 13th century. There would be camel expeditions from as far away as Baghdad and Cairo and the Spanish coast and the North African coast to come to this part of the world. We would often, as I mentioned, travel late at night, early in the morning. We'd pass these sort of hidden temples, and every once in a while we would stop and just wonder what these little pottery shards. Let me go back one image. Pottery, I'm going to go back. Sorry, that's not going backwards. This is moving forwards. Let's see, excuse me. Go back one more. We would stop and we'd find these little pottery shards, and there's a constant wind in the Sahara Desert. Pick up this pottery shard. And of course, in the 12th century, some 9,000 years ago, even before that, the Sahara Desert was green. So there was all these cultures living throughout the Sahara Desert. So you'd see these pottery shards and the wind would be blowing, and you'd realize that pottery probably the day before was covered in sand. The next day would probably be covered in sand for another 1,000 years. And so I have a collection of these pottery shards that are 9,000 years old. And then you arrive at the salt mine, and it is a scene out of the Bible. There are slaves. There's still slaves working this salt mine, digging out and chiseling the salt. They line it up, and after the camels have rested for a day or two, they load up the camels and they head south, back down to Timbuktu, back down to Mopti. And it's the tradition of doing this because they could access Western salt a lot easier by just going to the market. But it's the tradition of the young boys going with the fathers on this ancient ritual, this ancient tradition that keeps the fabric of these societies together. When you start taking those traditions out in any indigenous traditional culture, it's like unraveling a thread and it falls apart. So for me, it's important to document many of these cultures before it changes. You go down into southern Mali and you arrive at the Dogon. The Dogon is a culture that is very much like the Anasazi in the Southwest, and withstood the onslaught of Islam as it came through in the 12th and 13th century. This is a young boy going through his initiation ritual with the Sergei mask. He's holding that in his teeth. It's not tied to him. It's about 15 feet tall. And for that period of time that he's going through his initiation ritual, he's the conduit with the spiritual world. It's almost as if he has the antenna into the spiritual world for the earthly world and the messages that come down. Spent a lot of time in West Africa, the Burkina Faso, Togo, Benin, southern Mali, Niger, documenting these primitive masks. This is kind of the epicenter of many of the mask rituals, and many of these masks you see in the Museum Natural History, the Metropolitan in New York City. These remarkable masks, again, that are the conduit between the spiritual world and the earthly world. Unfortunately, you can't go back to many of these places now because different forms of Al-Qaeda really kind of surged into Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, areas like that. Another beautiful sacred site, of course, is Petra in Jordan, and had the opportunity to be there on a full moon during a special celebration. Someone had put out 1,000 candles. When the Romans came in and kicked the Mesopotamians out of Petra, they went deep, deep into Saudi Arabia. 2 years ago, we finally got permission to go into Saudi Arabia, and the Mesopotamians ended up at Ala Ula in the deep, empty corridor. And this is on a full moon. This is a funeral kind of cave. The sun is just beginning to come up, and that's the full moon bathing on that particular ruin. If you have a chance, go to Saudi Arabia. It is a remarkable, remarkable country. Looping it back, I'm Canadian, and I'm absolutely connected to my Canadian culture, and of course, connected to British Columbia, where I come from, and up about 500 miles north along on the British Columbia coast is the Haida Gwaii, Queen Charlotte Islands, this culture that was rich in wealth because of the pelts and the salmon, and they built these totem poles. They believe that the totem pole should go back to nature. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, an amazing, amazing place. You see examples of trees growing up and taking over the totems. Beautiful spot. And again, for me, it's that symbolism of anything that man does, eventually nature permeates and destroys and takes over. Also in this area are the ancient rituals of the potlatch. Many of the Native American, North American, including Canada, rituals were either exterminated or outlawed, or many of the masks were stolen. And so there's a group on the northwest coast of Vancouver Island, a place called Alert Bay, that have built a cultural center, and they're single-handedly getting repatriation of the masks up. We were very lucky to get permission to be able to photograph the masks. This is the raven mask. This is, of course, the orca or the sea killer whale. Beautiful masks. And now the potlatch is allowed, of course, and these rituals of the potlatch in the Longhouse are alive and well, happening right now as we speak. And that's what, for me, is really exciting. I have optimism. I do believe we're going through a renaissance of traditional culture. I see it everywhere I go with the traditional cultures. Yes, there's a struggle. Yes, there's a lot of wounds, but I see the younger generation saying, no, I'm proud to be Quechua. No, I'm proud to be Haida, and I want to show the world, and I want to do these rituals. And I think as we have homogenized the world, humans want to hang on to their identity. So that is very powerful. This incredible gentleman that we hired to model, if you will, all the different masks was a very sweet young man. And one day he said, you know, my brother committed suicide. He was the chief. I am now the chief. I am the chief of the Bear Clan. And we had an incredible conversation. And for me, side story, I had wanted to photograph the bear mask for about 10 years. It's one of the more sacred, secret, ritualized costumes, regalia of North American natives. And I had wanted to gain permission to be able to photograph these masks. And so he said, if you want me to bring my mask, you can photograph it. So the next day he brought it. We had the great honor and privilege of being able to photograph this very, very powerful mask. So we live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. New Mexico is home to many beautiful Native American tribes. And just as I was mentioning, there's a huge renaissance going. Even today, you can go to the pueblos during the winter and they will invite you in, and you have these incredible bonfires and the white buffalo. So this is the local pueblo that's about 5 miles from where we live. This is the white buffalo. This is the deer dance. So on the full moon in January, this Delfonso Pueblo, you go there, there's a huge bonfire. It's the full moon. You can hear 100 men coming down the hill in the deer costumes. You see the bells, so you hear the bells and them chanting. They come down and dance around the fire. To have that still alive today is such a privilege. The black bear. And then at the very end of my mask project, I had heard of this remarkable Tlingit Indian named Gene. He was Gene the Raven Dancer. So I reached out to him. I said, I've seen your costume. I'd love to photograph you if you want. So it took a couple of months. We eventually connected. We picked out a spot right on the Tacoma Bay where he lived. Sun was going down. He was late. I was getting nervous. The clouds came in. I thought, well, he's maybe not going to arrive. He arrived. We did a fantastic photographic documentation experience. We started connecting. As we were walking back to the car, he said, you know, Chris, the problem with my culture is that we're trying to decolonize the Western ways. He said, I personally, as a Tlingit, think that's wrong. What we should all be doing, all of us, regardless of our color and our background, is to re-indigenize ourselves, reconnect, rewild ourselves to the planet. I'd like to end the lecture today with a quote by Margaret Mead, the great social anthropologist, who once said, having been born into a polychromatic world, her greatest fear for her grandchildren, in fact, our greatest fear for all of our children, is that they will wake up one day in a monochromatic world and never know there was a difference. Thank you very much. Thank you. Questions? I would love to answer questions. Any question, fire away. Kelly, yeah. You behave yourself, Trav.
I just want to know if you have any tattoos now.
Do you have any tattoos? I was tempted. I was very tempted. But there's a great New Yorker cartoon of the sailor sitting down. He's got a cigarette and it says, I love, and then it's semicolon, and there's about 13 names all scrawled off, and he's getting a new one. It's like, it's there forever. And eventually gravity works and you know, your body's not quite what that beautiful tattoo. So I'm still working on it. I would love to get it.
I'm not asking a question, but I hope you enjoyed this voyage, because the voyage is very alive, and it was Chris, Wade Davis, the spirit of the mask you just saw in Nepal at Nagarjuna Mountain. Chris photographed our students, Catholic U students, Spirit of Place, for National Geographic that year. this is a really important mission in terms of cultural history and sanctifying and nature, to show you that architecture, the next wave of architecture, is based deeply on the ancient way, whether it's classical or whether it's based in cultures that you've never even heard of. So I just wanted to plug that in, because I know you're all architects wondering, what are we doing out in the forest here? But that forest is full of great ideas for great architecture. And I'm proud to say Catholic U has spent years promoting and dealing with just that particular issue. Where do we go into our deepest selves and come back in architecture?
And I just have to say, the students' work that I saw today, I saw that connection to nature. I saw that spiritual question and that sense of sacred. And I know that's an overused word, but sacred, everything is sacred if you look at it the right way. Any questions? I'll take any question. Even if I have a tattoo, I can answer them. Okay, yes, sir.
A long buildup for simple questions. What's next?
What's next? Well, Travis barely touched upon it, rightly so. A book published last week on the future of exploration. We live in a world where, yes, we've gone to the South Pole, we've gone to the North Pole, we've gone to Everest, we've gone to the bottom of the ocean, we've gone put a man on the moon. What's next? Is there anything more to explore? That could not be further from the truth. We are in this remarkable period of exploration. We are, what I would say, is actually in the golden era of exploration. Number one, because of technology. So one of the authors, there's 39 authors for this book, is a woman who's a space archaeologist. She sits and she actually buys LiDAR satellite images that are ground penetrating. And so she looks for anomalies and then decides to look there. So for the Egyptian government, she's found 22 new sites that the Egyptians never knew about. So we have this drive with this incredible amount of technology. Even AI, the controversial AI, is redefining exploration. Now, the beauty about exploration is you can do your computer stuff, but then eventually she has to put the backpack on and go out there and climb the mountain or go into the middle of the Sahara Desert. But we have all sorts of people. The other part of our book, and the exciting part, is diversity. Traditionally, white men in pith helmets went off and found the source of the Nile. We live in a remarkable moment where scientists and explorers and indigenous elders are coming together and showing us that the world, as I mentioned earlier, is to be seen in different ways. And finally, the final point is conservation. The urgency is that the only way we're going to solve this complex problem is not just to have science look at it, but to have traditional knowledge, which is really, truly the definition of sustainability, have a seat at the table. And that's what our organization is focusing all about, is including indigenous knowledge. So that's next. Much to the chagrin of Olivia, I've got about 3 more book ideas that I'm not allowed to touch on for a couple of years, but future of exploration. We've got a big opening on Wednesday at the Explorers Club in New York, but got to keep going, running out of time.
When you were wonderful, incredible place. I've been able to travel to the Dogon country in Mali, so I really
Fantastic.
appreciate
It's
that Malian stuff. Yeah, amazing.
Amazing place.
You showed the pictures of Angkor Wat, and you talked about the power of being there. And so, in our 21st century, the ethics of travel, the carbon footprint of travel,
Yes.
over tourism, kind of the degrading of culture through tourism. Yes. Can you talk about the necessity to still be in these places?
Brilliant question, and there is no real easy answer. So I'm gonna sort of say 2 things. I'm deeply saddened by Instagram, because I show up in places now and there's 1,000 people there because someone posted last week on Instagram. And in fact, I just read a BBC article about this small, beautiful little village in Vermont that is now forbidding people to go in because 5 years ago it was beautiful and now there's 10,000 people that show up. And so there's that kind of consequence. There's the other one. If people don't go to places like Serengeti or East Africa, there will be no tourism. All of those animals will be slaughtered within years, and we will not have any more elephants, giraffes, or rhinos. So there's this complex that you have to have tourism in some places to maintain it. Look at the argument around Hawaii and Maui. It's like, whoop, the whole economy collapsed because no one had a job. So yes, we have to be really conscious of our footprint. And there are places that I've been that I will never tell National Geographic editor or anybody else where it is. Because I think you do have a responsibility when you kind of post on this and 10 million people show up. So we just responsible, if there's such a way to be responsible, and there's a backlash. People of places like Venice and when I worked for Ansel Adams, the director of the national park came and had a meeting with Ansel and said, because Ansel was concerned about the amount of people going into Yosemite, even back in the 1980s. And he said, we have a system in place that eventually the national park system will have a lottery system. So you as an American citizen will be able to go to X amount of national parks, and it will be a lottery system. Because now the average wait to get into Yosemite or Yellowstone is 4 hours during the summer. So something has to give. I don't know if I answered the question, but yep.
But certainly for architecture student, people studying space, culture, the built environment, how they all intersect. There's nothing that can replace
going there,
having that experience of the place. Like Angkor Wat, I've not traveled to yet. Of course, I want to go.
Yeah,
but you probably will never understand it without that.
Or
experience.
to come around the corner at the Taj Mahal at sunrise is to have a spiritual experience. Yes, sir. Okay.
You're a very good photographer.
Thank you very much.
Have you ever pursued the survivals of indigenous cultures or their evolutions, their manifestations in urban contexts? I mean, there's a lot of people who migrate to cities and manage to preserve and even to evolve their traditional practices. And I'm wondering if you'd ever try to trace those lines.
That's a very good question. I have to think about that. I mean, let us not kid ourselves. Being in the Garden of Eden is tough. That whole compensation thing, people want to get married, so the bride's price is 50 pigs. Then he has to go around to all of his family, and then he's indebted. And then there's the stress of living up to your family. And then if you want a divorce, so suicide is extremely high in a lot of traditional cultures because there are these ritualized. So it's the law of the jungle on some levels there. But so there is an urban stress, if you will, even within indigenous culture. So it's not, I don't for a moment have a romantic notion of the kind of shaman sitting there in a monastery in Tibet. There's humans are humans, regardless of what level we're operating on. There's stress and complexity. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for your lecture. It was incredible and breathtaking photos.
Thank you.
For sacred sites and heritage places, I'm thinking like Machu Picchu, Petra, Alula, like you showed. Do you think architectural interventions in the form of museums, visitor centers, and the like, do you think those are appropriate on site, or do you think it would be better to just leave the place wild?
We were involved in a project with National Geographic early on about the possibility of creating a cultural museum, living museum, if you will, at Machu Picchu. There's one now at Luxor and Egypt. I personally, not being an architect, I think it's good, and it gives you the information that you don't even know that you need to have to appreciate the place. And certainly with the technology now that you can virtual glasses, you can see what it was. So I'm totally behind that. But then there's a time to put the glasses off and sit there and just be in the power of the place. So yes, I think those are important, very important. But I also love taking a camel across the Sahara Desert and seeing a monument just drifting in the sand with no visitor center there. That's a remarkable experience as well.
This is something that I found powerful. That's you said that this individual said that instead of them decolonizing,
Yes.
we need to rewild ourselves. And short of traveling to these wild places, and many people, of course, don't have resources or the time or obligations that impede them to do. How would you rewild? How can I rewild myself to really have?
Washington is amazing. You've got Tacoma, what is it? The park where, just not Tacoma. What's Rock Creek Park? Sorry, I had a mind freeze. This is a beautiful city. There's all sorts of nature here. So, just take a moment to go outside, just sit. It's a beautiful campus here to sit under a tree, but make an effort to go to the West, go to Canada. I'm going to advertise Canada, second largest country in the world that goes all the way to the North Pole. It's not that far. There's wilderness. There's an amazing amount of wilderness. So
by this you meant nature.
Yes.
Nature.
Yes.
Rewild myself through a reconnecting to nature.
Yes.
In a way that is not biased, not necessarily to have an encounter with other cultures or other ways of seeing the world, like you're saying, that particular culture that you met that never had encountered another white person, and suddenly you have a new understanding of what to be human. You're talking more about renaturalizing myself through nature.
That is correct. E.O. Wilson. Yep.
The important question. Is not just nature, but culture.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed when we did, I don't know if you guys can hear it, Spirit of Place projects, which Chris was very involved in, and others, the spirit of the mask. How can we go there as architects of this century? We could just do the same piece again, which I think is really important for restoring your colony, but also you can reinterpret it in a modern idiom so that the spirit is still there, but you're also getting into the modern world. You have to sort of be doing both. It's just a matter of time before the world gets homogenized. And so in the interim, how can you cultivate an architecture that speaks to those stories? We speak to the Greek-Roman story very well because it's a big part of our culture, but there's so many other things out there, but you can still do it with the modern, because a lot of people in those villages and places want to live in the modern world too, but not necessarily wear the same sweater as 78 other people.
And there is a big movement. What I love about Mongolia is that everybody kind of started moving to Ulaanbaatar, the city. And over the last 10 years, it's become very congested. And the nomads said, to the hell with that. So they jumped in their Toyota Land Cruisers and headed back out. And there's a huge movement around the world back out into nature, certainly with indigenous people. That's got a lot to do with too many people educated, overeducated, and you end up in poverty. But the point being, I think, find your way to rewild. E.O. Wilson wrote a book on just the point. It's called Half World, and there's a lot of studies done on 50% of the planet still needs to be wild. If we start dropping below that, we start caving in on ourselves. So there's a certain amount of wildness, nature that we need out there.
Last question before we go to the reception. Anybody else? All right.
How should that 50-50 split be determined? Because we were talking earlier, right, about how there's complications to both sides. So
yeah, probably the best way for me to answer that, there's a huge movement in the conservation world now of 30 by 30, 30% of the planet by 2030. Don't think we're going to make it, but many countries have signed up for that. And through the United Nations, through IUCN and a number of other organizations, many countries are trying to step up to the plate and set aside 30% of their wilderness or rewild it. There's a huge reforestation movement. So it's very cumbersome. We won't make it, but it's an aspiration to try and move in that direction, to at least slow down what we're doing to the Amazon or primary forests around the world.
And you also talked about the importance of continuity. There's not a bunch of islands.
Yes.
But then you could have a wide
Corridor.
path from Canada
Yes.
to Mexico.
And
So that there can be migration of species.
absolutely. And you make a very good point that's been very much part of the conservation movement in the last 10, 15 years are these corridors. So figure out the migratory paths of the elephants in Africa or whatever and start connecting these places. So reconnecting.
Well, let's thank Chris for a great lecture.
Thank you.
Please join us for the reception in Miller. And if you have credit for the AIA, please put your name down. I'll take care of it.
Can I
Thank you,
get
Ken.
it credit too? Thank you.